Texas is known for its small towns that started as just a bump in the road. The majority of them never lasted more than a few years or maybe a decade or so. Well, not so the city of Kemah. Although Kemah didn't start out under this name, eventually this small community grew to become one of the treasures of the Texas Gulf Coast. The now extinct Karankawa Indian tribe was the first to inhabit this area of Texas. Their tribal grounds ran from Galveston Bay southwest to what is now Corpus Christi Bay. These larger-than-life Indians were not what are seen on movie screens of today. The Karankawa Indians were built for the Texas coast, between 6 and 7 feet tall, covered in tattoos and smelly shark liver oil to protect them from mosquitoes. Their threatening appearance and smell were noted in the journals of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca in 1528, after he and his men were shipwrecked near Kemah during the Narvaez expedition. De Vaca lived with the Karankawa of the Gulf Coast for several years, no doubt learning to appreciate the easy way of a hard life, good plentiful food, and easy travel by water of the inland waterways. These early Kemah residents had no idea they set the stage for future generations. They learned to consume many kinds of fish and oysters that lived in the brackish waters of the bay during the winter months. Also ducks, alligators, deer, turkey. All of these animals were plentiful to feed the villages that contained small huts made of long sapling tree trunks or limbs bent over and tied together. Karankawa would stick one end of the tree limb or sapling into the ground in a big circle. Then they would bend them over towards the middle and tie them together, making a framework. They would cover this framework with woven grass mats, palm leaves, or animal skins. They'd cover the floor with woven grass mats. These rather large villages were the way of life on the Kemah side of the Galveston Bay, not much different to the fishing villages and summer cottages of the future Kemah, Texas. Almost 300 years later was the first modern-day recording of what was to become Kemah. It began when a labor of land was recorded with the Mexican government as a land grant given to Michael Goodrich on August 24, 1824. A labor of land is an old measurement that equaled about 177 acres of land today. Goodrich was listed as one of Stephen F. Austin's Old 300, the first people to settle in Texas. Within 10 years, the Texas Revolution ended just a few miles from modern-day Kemah, and the Goodrich land, while divided and sold several times following the War for Texas independence, was acquired by Elizabeth Scobie Justice in 1853.
Yes, we had Indians, and those were the Karankawa Indians. And the town became a town after the Kipp family and the Bradford family started buying up land at the Goodrich property. And they established a little city or town, and they called it Evergreen. But when they went to approach the state for a post office, Evergreen was already taken. So they decided on the name Kemah, which means facing the wind, an Indian word.
Jane, the daughter of Abraham and Elizabeth, married James Bradford, and in the 1890s reacquired the balance of the original Goodrich Mexican land grant. Their beautiful new two-story home was built with at least some of the proceeds of the sale of oyster shell reef that was dug up and sold to the oncoming Texas and New Orleans Railroad for 75 cents per rail card load. This incoming railroad was the first full breath of life for the future city of Kemah. The expansions of the railroad brought more people to farm and work the land around the mouth of Clear Creek. This proved vital for the Bradford family, who began to subdivide their land into town lots in 1898 and establish the township of Evergreen. Still, the only way to get to this little place by the sea was by boat, not over the Gulf, but by ferry, and it was not very fast.
Oh, back in the early days when we didn't have a bridge, like the one we have today, we had a wooden bridge, flat, just like the grade of the highway, and before that there was a ferry that was hand-pulled across. As a matter of fact, my grandfather, Captain Robbie Strasding, was one of the people that helped hand-pull that ferry across between Kemah and Seabrook. And now today we've got the big bridge.
This little community became a getaway for those in Houston who could afford to get out of the city to cool off and relax. It was a lovely place to build a summer retreat. Old families like the Schott family of Houston, who established Schott's Bakery, were some of the first families to build a home for their kids and teach them the ways of summertime fun.
I always remember my grandfather talking about having met people that knew people who were with Jean Lafitte, and stories about hidden treasures and all the times that he went out on certain islands out in the bay looking for hidden treasures. And of course that was, a very interesting story, but he never found anything but old Indian artifacts.
It didn't take long for Houstonians to discover the hidden treasure that became Kemah. It became an ideal place to have fun and keep family close.
I believe the boatyard was one of the first businesses that was built, the Platzer Boatyard. And the first families, a lot of the families came down from Houston for just weekend homes. And the Corinthian Yacht Club at that time, which is down south of Kema, a lot of people were boating and they'd come down to the water. Water's always been an attraction for them.
With the influx of families came the need for schools. The Kip family built the first school. It was a community affair. In early Texas, it was not uncommon for the men to build the schools and the churches before they built homes for the families. These early schools stayed the same for many decades until Galveston County unified the school district in 1912.
Well, most of us went barefoot. A few of us had shoes. We didn't like to wear shoes because we were just comfortable barefooted. There weren't many people in our class, so we always got a lot of attention. We had playground time. The porch that's on the school, we used to play the king of the porch and knock each other off the porch. We climbed trees. Some of the boys played marbles underneath the building. When we had enough people, we'd organize a little baseball team. We'd play out in the outside. Didn't have any equipment. Most of us didn't have balls or anything to bring to school to play with. No organized sports other than just what we organized ourselves out in the street or after school. Played a lot of games until dark, or the mosquitoes would run us in, one or the other.
But with the families and the weekenders and the big money from Houston, the warm breezes and clear waters brought with it something new: gambling. It is said that the Macios controlled the gambling in Galveston, while the Salvatos controlled the gambling in Kema. During the 1940s and 1950s, many people remember working during those wild days of Kema.
All the businesses were sort of like restaurants or cafes or beer joints, but upstairs it was all kinds of gambling. My mother worked in a club, and then I worked as a cashier and hostess when I got high school age and college age. I worked at Edgewater, and upstairs in the club we had a little a file of people, and when they would come in they'd have to pay like $2 or $3 to be a member, and then they could have mixed drinks. And during the gambling days, I remember we had a place behind where Edgewater is now, and it was called the Beach House, and it was nothing but a big dance floor, and then it had all kinds of slot machines in it.
During those times, even the prominent of Kema wet their beaks from time to time. Former Mayor Ben Blackledge had a small dice game for a while until the state troopers showed him the light. His widow, Joanne, presented her husband with a framed plaque of the old days.
I have a lot of the chips on a plaque. It's a plaque, about like so, and it has a lot of the different colored chips on it from the old casinos in Galveston County. The White House, I think, is on there from Kema. That was one of the names of them.
Many of the residents grew up with it, but as they were too young, they didn't realize gambling was going on until many years later.
I don't know that there was, but I do know that I went to certain places with my parents and my grandparents. One of them was called the Chili Bowl, which was back over in this area. And we would go in for dinner, and then my mother and dad would get up and leave and go behind this red velvet curtain. And they'd be gone 45 minutes to an hour, and then they'd come back and stay with the kids, and Grandma and Grandpa would disappear for 45 minutes to an hour. So You know, back then the children were having hamburgers and french fries, and you know, those dinners sometimes lasted 5-6 hours at a time, so obviously there was something going on back then.
My first remembrance of Kemah was coming to Kemah when I was 4 years old, and this is after the old Jimmy Walker building that was blown away by Hurricane Carla. This is after it had mysteriously caught on fire, and this was after the Texas Attorney General was vowed and determined to shut down gambling in Galveston County. And my grandfather was operating the restaurant on the first floor, and there was a casino on the second floor called the Edgewater Casino. So he, you know, the only rule he had to do is he had to stay open to 4 o'clock in the morning to serve the gamblers. And mysteriously that place caught on fire. He was extremely mad about it. Went down to Galveston, talked to the Macios, who had something to do with the things that were going on in Galveston County at the time. And they ended up selling him the property and financing it. So he was not too upset with them at the end of their meeting. And my first remembrance was coming down and visiting him, and I was 4 years old, and being in the building as it was gutted out by the fire. And that was my very first remembrance of Kemah. And I remember going around to all the little honky-tonks and coffee shops and different little things in town. And there was always slot machines and these big tables with green felt on them. And, you know, it was just a lot of activity in the middle of the night all the time. And it was, you know, it was a lot of fun.
For most of Kemah's longtime residents, they remember the 28 years that Ben Blackledge was mayor.
He loved it. It was his life. And we made a good living here.
When he and Joanne settled in Kemah, he fell in love like so many others and started buying land. Joanne says that was the fire that started his love for Kemah.
He said the reason he ran for mayor was because he owned the most property in Kemah, and he wanted to be able to run the town so he could run his business.
Mayor Blackledge saw changes that many others did not. He saw the future and kept working to make Kemah the best little town he could. It was not uncommon for him to meet every new citizen who moved to town. It was not only his job as mayor, but just good business.
Well, he's one of the first persons that my parents met when they moved here. And of course, he made that, you know, that was a goal of his. I mean, if you moved to town, he was going to meet you. He was mayor. And my dad was very involved in Pasadena. And so when he moved here, I would say he was a mover and a shaker, so Ben wanted to know him. So Ben and Joanne got to know my parents real well, and that's really ultimately how I met Ben and Joanne, was having, you know, coffee at Tom's every afternoon. They were in there every afternoon, sat in the same seat. I mean, they might as well have had their name on the back of the chair, you know. But you could always find Ben and Miss B driving around town. Miss B was his dog, and she rode in the car with him. And I bought the first lot I ever bought in Kemah. I bought it from Ben.
When the ferry went and the bridge came, Kemah grew. When a bigger bridge came, Kemah grew. Blackledge saw it all coming and welcomed it.
When the bridge came through, he said it was a gateway to the bay. That was his deal there. Then when the marina came in, he said Kemah will never be the same. Then he went out and he done the Kemah Oaks, and he said now the vote has changed. Then the other part of Kemah down on 146 was annexed. He said now the votes have really changed.
But politics in Kemah were never as rough and tumble as other Texas cities, at least not in those times. When you run for mayor over 28 years, you'd think that a man would make an enemy or two. Well, not Ben Blackledge.
There was a preacher that ran against Ben for mayor, and he said, I'm going to clean the town, sweep the town clean. Ben said, brother, I'll buy you the broom. If you beat me, I'll buy the broom. I'll pay for it.
Well, Ben won again, and then they all went down for dinner at the diner. This was the Kemah way, close families who could never hold a grudge. 1961 was a busy year for Kemah. The city was incorporated and got a visitor from the Gulf, Hurricane Carla. Newspaper reports of that time say Kemah was covered with a foot of mud. 40 to 50 houses were washed away, and it lost or had damaged all of its restaurants and clubs. But life on the Gulf makes people tough, and residents here picked themselves up and rebuilt. Things really began to move after Carla. The gambling was gone, but now it became time for Kemah to really push itself up from the sleepy little village to a thriving tourist destination.
I would say landscaping and concrete changed Kemah, because when the boardwalk came in, it cleaned up Kemah. The marina was the first thing that cleaned up Kemah. A lot of the old houses that flooded all the time were torn down. And then when the marina was built, it seemed like every new place came in and put in landscaping and put in concrete. And when you'd see the landscaping, it would kind of encourage you to clean up your yard, and the next business would come in and do the same thing. Well, they've cleaned up their yard, we'll clean up our yard, and then the residents started cleaning up their yards. So I think overall it cleaned up Kemah. That was a change for the good.
Many people remember when their parents had made Kemah their home, and from the early days they knew that living here required planning in every facet of your life.
You never bought anything if you were going to have to go over the drawbridge that might melt or whatever. And then when the new bridge came in, it made it much more accessible. And then some of the traffic, I think, diverted from 45 going toward Galveston. And like when I went to the beach, I always went down 146, whereas everybody else, especially those that weren't locals, they would go down 45. And then with the advent of the marina, that was probably the biggest change I noticed before I moved here. That changed the whole complexion of the town. And of course that was a Ben Blackledge project. And but yeah, I think that put Kemah on the map. It's the third largest boating recreational port in the United States of America as a result of that. So we have everything here.
Most of the early landmarks of Kemah have long since disappeared. One remains the same, the little spot out on the point that everyone coming in from a day on the water would see as home.
I think maybe the one place that there's always been a restaurant is where Landry's is today, because it started out as a place called the Friends Place, and then it was the Oyster Shack, and then it was Edgewater and Jimmy Walker's Edgewater, and then it's now become Landry's. So we've always had a spot right there on the channel that would be, I consider it a landmark.
From Friends Place, the Oyster Shack, Edgewater, and now Landry's, these were the landmarks of childhood memories and history that brought Tillman Fertitta to Kemah in the mid-1990s.
Gosh, I guess when I was a young kid, I think anybody growing up in the Houston-Galveston area went to Kemah at some point when they were growing up, because it was kind of the waterfront of Houston. Well, I would say back then it was more like the Seabrook side too, where you had a few good restaurants, but it was still more of the shell parking lots and more of the old look. I had made a deal with, I think, Matt Wiggins, who was the grandson of Jimmy Walker. After Hurricane Alicia, the restaurant was just a big old busted up building with seagulls living in it. And we opened that up, and it was very successful for the next few years. And one day I was walking out of it, and I started thinking, gosh, if I could acquire all this different land here and put something together, I could create, a real tourist attraction for Houston. And in Houston, people have been talking about doing boardwalks down on the bayou for years and creating entertainment venues. But growing up in Galveston, I always know people want to get away a little bit. And so, I started acquiring properties and kind of put the whole deal together, and, we hit it real hard. And, the boardwalk opened in 1996.
Fertitta and other business owners that thrive in this seaside town had no idea their dreams would become this large.
Probably not. I mean, it's on everybody's list of the top 3 or 5 boardwalks in the world. It does over 2 million visitors a year, and it's a year-round project. And even in our worst months, we still do a lot of business. And it's a great attraction for Houston. We're not a huge convention town, so to have it just 30, 40 minutes away next to the NASA and Manned Space Center, it's great for the people who visit Houston and the people that live in Houston.
Kema indeed had a bright future because it embraces not only its people, but the businesses run by many of them. It's a juggling act to keep both parties happy.
Kema's like no other town of 1,700, I can assure you of that. My whole family loves Kema, and my grandkids love to come down here. There's just no other place where you can get around in a golf cart. You've got the water view, you've got the third largest boating capital around, and it's a lot of good people. It's a small town feel. I grew up on a farm outside a town just about this size, so I've always felt like Kema was the place for us, and I plan to retire here.
This is why the town of Kema boasts just under 1,800 full-time residents and grows each year. The combination of a small town feel with a rich mixture of visitors from around the world.
I loved that I could go into Houston and see anything cosmopolitan and international that there was, but yet I lived in a small town atmosphere that was very, very safe, and everybody knew each other. And I wanted to raise my children in that kind of environment, and I think I did. I think they're going off to college now. One's, a sophomore in college, and one's about to go off to college. I think they were raised in a small town atmosphere, but have all the other regalia that comes with a big city cosmopolitan, type atmosphere as well.
One more thing about Kema that should show you its best side. Joanna Blackledge says she's had a hard time getting to this interview.
I'm fixing to get a concrete street in front of my house. It will be the first decent street ever. Ben couldn't do the street because he couldn't get votes, he said. So I've lived on the shabbiest street in Kema for all of my life.
I'm so excited to be mayor during our 50th celebration of our city, and over the past few years, my wife Colleen and I have gotten out, and we know a lot of people in Kema, and there's just no better place to live, work, and play than Kema, Texas, and again, I'm so excited to be a part of it.
It just goes to show you that time passes slowly in Kema, and the residents and visitors, well, they wouldn't have it any other way.